back to History Class with Dr. W. In our previous lecture, we talked about some of the early skirmishes of the Revolutionary War, which are going to drive the colonists fully into the realm of seeking their own independence. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk more thoroughly about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and perhaps more importantly, the first of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. In January 1776, Thomas Paine, who had recently arrived in the colonies from England, wrote an inflammatory pamphlet that really drove the sense of independence in the colonies. This pamphlet was known as Common Sense. In the pamphlet, Thomas Paine attacked British policy, attacked the government, and particularly attacked the very idea of monarchy. His writing was very plain and simple and powerful. I'm going to share a few selections from this document in just a minute, but even now his writing kind of rings with a clarity that is remarkable. The book itself was a remarkable success in terms of sales and publication, and it caught fire through all of the colonies and really inspired Americans thinking about independence. Now, one of the things that Common Sense did that others had sort of come up short was it did not shy away from launching direct attacks against the monarchy. At one point, Thomas Paine called the idea of monarchy ridiculous. He denounced the king for his assaults on American liberty, and as we're going to see in a few of these quotes, launched powerful attacks against monarchy. And so in part, what Common Sense does is it begins to unravel the ties, even those who had declared that the colonies were loyal to the king. He begins to unravel even those arguments. So here are a few of the famous statements from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state, an intolerable one. Until an independence is declared, the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, yet knows it must be done, hates to set about it, wishes it over, and is continually haunted with the thoughts of its necessity. But Britain is the parent country, say some. Then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. And here is perhaps the most important phrase. Small islands, not capable of protecting themselves, are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In July of 1775, King George III had rejected Congress's olive branch petition, and in fact declared that the American colonies were in open and avowed rebellion. As a response to this, British Parliament in December of 1775 passed the Prohibitory Act, which banned all trade with the 13 colonies. Word of this ban arrived in the colonies in February 1776, just as the flames of Thomas Paine's Common Sense were sweeping throughout the colonies and calling for independence. And so with all of those factors coming together, the call for independence grew in early to mid-1776. In May, the Continental Congress instructed individual colonies, quote, to adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents. In essence, each colony was declaring its independence from the crown at that point. So we have not had a formal declaration of independence, but the colonies are working in that direction. Now, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in Congress that, quote, these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And we're going to see that phrase creep in again in just a minute when we talk about the text of the Declaration itself. But at that point, Congress begins the discussion of declaring independence and appoints a committee to work on a draft of this declaration. The committee included John Adams of Massachusetts, Robert Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. And its most famous member and the author, the primary author of what becomes the Declaration itself, is Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Now, Jefferson, in writing the Declaration, worked largely independently of the other four members of the committee, although he drew on a growing body of literature discussing and expressing ideas about independence, including Thomas Paine's Common Sense and some of his other writings that we've already discussed. So the most famous phrases in the Declaration of Independence, and words that most of us would be able to recite by heart, come in the preamble and the opening sentences of the Declaration. But for those who have not read the Declaration fully, start to finish, might not realize that the great bulk of the Declaration itself includes a long list of the reasons for breaking with Britain. There is within the Declaration a series of Declaration of Rights, and then also a long list of grievances against George III. Now, as we're going to discuss, the Declaration was intended largely for consumption within the colonies and people understanding why the colonies were in rebellion against the British government. It was also intended as a direct letter to George III explaining what the colonies were upset about and why they were engaged in rebellion. But it was also intended for international consumption as well. And the writers of the Declaration understood that leaders of foreign powers would probably also get their hands on this document and want to understand what the colonies were thinking. Ultimately, the colonists are going to need aid from other nations if they're going to win this war against Britain, and primarily they're going to need assistance from France. And so the Declaration, unlike Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the Declaration itself comes up short of condemning the idea of monarchy itself, because France was a monarchy as well, and they were going to need French aid. And so the grievances listed in the Declaration are pointed directly at George III as an individual, and not broadly at the idea of monarchy itself, which Thomas Paine had attacked, the idea of monarchy in general. And so the Declaration, which includes its famous phrases, concludes with these words: "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved."